Dr. Donald T. Williams. He's the Professor Emeritus of Toccoa Falls College. I'm not going to take credit for it. I'm going to just read from his book, 95 Theses for a New Reformation, a book I highly recommend. But he's a border dweller. He stays permanently camped out on the borders between theology and literature, serious scholarship and pastoral ministry, Narnia and Middle-earth. An ordained minister in the Evangelical Free Church of America, he has spent several summers training local pastors in Uganda, Kenya, and India for Church Planting International. A past president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, known as an Inkling Scholar and a Christian apologist, he is the author of 12 other books. So without further ado, Donald Williams.
It was a great honor to be chosen a few years ago as the president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics. That's this group, isn't it? Being nominated by Norm Geisler, one of my old professors from Trinity back in the golden age in Deerfield. And an equally great honor to be asked to be a plenary speaker by President Phil Fernandez, because he's not only the current president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, he is also the godfather of the evangelical mafia. So it's certainly a great honor to be there and to speak to you guys. After listening to Phil's excellent presentation this afternoon, I realized he probably had a different idea for what he was expecting when he asked me to speak on the abolition of man. Because Phil gave a very interesting presentation on the abolition of man that is taking place and that is being plotted by a lot of the intellectuals in our elite organizations today. And that would have been a really good lecture. I hope what I've decided to do will also count as a good lecture. We shall see. What I'm going to do is we are going to have an introduction that's happening right now, in case you missed it. And then we are going to talk about the moral argument for theism in mere Christianity. Why? Because the argument for objective value in the abolition of man is a powerful supplement to the moral argument. In fact, the moral argument for theism will be seen in its full strength only when you take the material from the abolition of man and plug it in to the presentation that's already there in mere Christianity. Then we will look at some critiques of that argument. We will examine what the abolition of man can add to it to strengthen it, and then we will look at some application in terms of what does this all mean for our apologetic that we are trying to bring forth today. One of C.S. Lewis's most cogent and powerful arguments is in his scintillating little book, The Abolition of Man. The brilliance of the book is widely recognized. Lewis was invited to deliver the Riddle Memorial Lectures at Durham University in February of 1943. And the book was the published version of those lectures. While the lectures seem to have been so closely reasoned that they puzzled some members of the audience, the initial reception to their publication was muted, and none of the few reviewers of the first edition seemed to realize its importance, George Sayer reports. Nevertheless, the book is now recognized as the best existing defense of objective value and the natural law. Travers thinks that Lewis's unflinching commitment to universal objective moral standards in the face of the subjectivist drift in modern culture is his great contribution to ethical thinking in the modern world. The book has been called perhaps the best defense of natural law to be published in the 20th century. The most profound of Lewis's cultural critiques and an eloquent example of his ruthless reasoning powers at their most effective. Due to the nature of the lecture series he was invited to give, Abolition is an apology not for Christianity itself, but simply for the objectivity of value. Now, that is a hugely important issue in the culture wars that surround us in its own right. But for our purposes as Christian apologists, the importance of the book is as a supplement to Lewis's moral argument for theism in mere Christianity. It strengthens the case for the objectivity and universality of moral values, which are essential elements of that larger argument, and extends it to cover other values besides moral values as well. We will therefore revisit Lewis's version of the moral argument in mere Christianity, and then see what abolition can add to it. In the dark days of World War II, James Welch of the BBC, having been impressed by Lewis's first apologetics book, The Problem of Pain, wrote to Lewis asking him to do a series of religious talks on the radio. These broadcast talks eventually grew into the book we now know as Mere Christianity. Starting from square one and trying to reconnect people with the Christian hope, Lewis began with the common human experience of trying to live with the inner sense that somehow life asks of us a certain fairness in our behavior, suggesting that this experience is in fact an important clue to the meaning of the universe. Hence my title for this lecture about the abolition of man, A Clue to the Clue. Lewis thus gave us a classic example of what is traditionally known as the moral argument for theism. The argument has 3 steps. First, it must try to demonstrate that we find ourselves subject to a moral law that is both objective and universal. It's universal, it's real, it's objective, it's not dependent on how people feel about things. We didn't just make it up. Second, it must show that secular explanations of this law, that it is purely subjective, that it is a result of conditioning or of culture, that it is a product of evolution, fail adequately to account for its actual features. Third, it argues that therefore the best explanation for this phenomenon is that there is a moral lawgiver, that is, God. The argument will be persuasive to the extent that it successfully shows that a real objective moral law exists and that the alternative explanations of it are indeed unworkable or inadequate. The advantage of it is that if it's successful, it points to the existence of God in such a way as to highlight our moral guilt before His law. Thus, it provides a natural segue into the presentation of the gospel. The good news that this God has provided a way of redemption from that guilt through the gift of His Son. So we're going to unpack each one of these 3 steps in turn. Lewis brilliantly begins the first step, not with abstract ideas, but with a concrete scenario that everyone can relate to. A dispute over some action, cutting in line, refusing to share, failing to keep a promise that is deemed unacceptable. People in such situations do not merely express their dislike of the act, they imply that it was wrong. It failed to meet some standard of fairness or rightness that is assumed to exist and to be acknowledged by both parties. Curiously, even people who think of themselves as moral relativists will talk like this when faced with such a disagreement, especially if they perceive themselves to be the victim of the alleged wrong. There are no moral relativists. There are simply people who think of themselves, they identify as moral relativists, but all you have to do is wrong them in some way, and you will discover the emptiness of that claim. which is really strange. I mean, Lewis is going to show us a lot of things about human nature that are really strange and cry for an explanation. I think that's one of them. So, the standard is there, and people appeal to it even when they deny its existence. Does this standard really exist, and do people feel themselves subject to it? Lewis asked those who questioned this proposition to do a simple thought experiment. Try to imagine a world in which people felt proud of cowardice or admired someone who stabbed people who had been good to him in the back. To do this experiment is to realize that differences between the moralities of different cultures are more superficial than they might appear. Some cultures are monogamous and others are polygamous, but they all recognize the institution of marriage, and they all, at least until very, very, very recent times, have thought it was a very, very serious thing to violate it. Lewis concludes that virtually all people have this strange idea about how they're supposed to act, and that none of them always acts that way. He finds this odd. He wants us to ask where this standard came from, and he promises that the answers explored in the following chapters will be a clue to the meaning of the universe. In chapter 2, Lewis starts dealing with what he calls objections. These are essentially attempts to explain this moral law or natural law in secular terms. If they are successful, then there's no need to appeal to a supernatural explanation. So we've entered step 2 of the argument as we outlined it above. Lewis deals with 3 common attempts to provide a secular account. First, what if the moral sense is really just an instinct? Say the human race's herd instinct. This would be a way of attributing it to evolution. What if it's really just a social convention, like shaking hands? This would be a way of reducing it to part of our culture. Wouldn't have to be the same for you if you were from a different culture. And what if it is simply a form of utilitarianism, a calculation of what kind of behavior would benefit the human race as a whole? Here, the moral sense would really be just a form of enlightened self-interest. Lewis tries to show that each of these explanations ultimately fails to explain. The theory that the moral sense is an instinct founders on the fact that an instinct is not an obligation. It's a strong, innate impulse to behave in a certain way. But that's not the same thing as a sense that one ought to behave in that way. This becomes obvious when 2 of our actual instincts come into conflict. Seeing a person in a dangerous situation, say a person who is drowning, might trigger a desire to help, which might indeed be from our herd instinct. But there might also be a desire to stay clear of the situation, stemming from the instinct for self-preservation. Well, Lewis points out that there is going to probably be a third force at work, an inner voice that tells us we ought to obey the instinct to help and ignore the instinct to stay clear. That voice is not an instinct like the first 2 at all, but something else that judges between them. It is the part of us that is in touch with the moral law. The second theory, that the moral sense is really just a social convention, something we picked up from our parents, is given plausibility by the fact that there are many aspects of our culture that we did learn from our parents or others, and which might be very different if we had had other parents and other teachers. Westerners greet each other by shaking hands, Orientals by bowing, Frenchmen by kissing each other on the cheek. Well, is the moral law like shaking hands? Maybe it is, because if you shake hands if you grew up in one society, you bow to each other if you grew up in another one, and maybe that's all that's going on. But the moral law may well be more than just a social custom, Lewis says, because just because you learned something doesn't mean that people just made it up and could have made it up differently. We all learned things like the multiplication table or the periodic table of elements in school. It does not follow that they are simply human inventions that could be different in other cultures. If you don't use the same multiplication table in China or India that we use in the West, your airplanes are going to crash. If you don't use the same periodic table of the elements that everybody else uses, your dinners are going to kill people. We had a really good Indian dinner, some of us tonight, I think because Wynn and Phil wanted to make sure that I would be on fire for God. And you can judge whether or not it was working. Okay? So, is the moral law like shaking hands, or is it like the multiplication table? Again, try to just imagine a society trying to run on a completely different set of moral principles, and it wouldn't run very well at all. Is the moral law like shaking hands, or is it like the multiplication table? Lewis gives two reasons why it belongs in the second class with the multiplication table. First, the differences between the moralities of various cultures are not as great as people think. They are best interpreted as variations on a common theme or on a set of common themes. More importantly, cultural relativism as an account of morality leads to an absurdity. It would remove any grounds for opposition to evils such as the Holocaust. If the morality of the Allies was more true than that of the Nazis, then there must be some real morality for them to be true about. Now, the passage of time may have rendered Lewis's example less potent for us than it was for his original audience, who lived in the very throes of the Second World War and at a period when it wasn't at all certain that the Allies were going to win. It was not at all certain that Hitler was not going to impose his morality on the entire world, the entire West. So that was a gut-wrenching, that was a sucker punch, really, to use that example. Well, no problem. Simply substitute the morals of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which make a virtue of killing and even torturing people who do not believe in radical Islam. This does not, by the way, contradict Lewis's point about the universality of the moral law. It is that very universality which makes aberrations like these stand out. Without it, they would not be aberrations, and our justification for treating them as such would disappear. Giving up the moral right to be opposed to terrorism or racism or any other ism that happens to be the moral cause du jour is a high price to pay for clinging to the comfort of cultural relativism. It is, in fact, a price people are willing to pay only in theory. Do you recall the days after the terrorist attacks of 9/11? Some of us are old enough to remember that. Moral relativism virtually disappeared from America for about 6 months before it then started creeping back in. No one being robbed or assaulted thinks that the actions of his assailant are only unpleasant or inconvenient. When actually confronted with them, we immediately know and are forced to admit what we actually knew deep down all along: they are wrong. But where does that idea come from on a naturalistic basis? The third theory, that the moral sense is simply pragmatism, that we accept these rules because we think it generally pays us to do so, also makes sense up to a point. There's a reason why these are popular theories. They're not just stupid, they actually do make sense up to a point, but Lewis's point is that point falls short of where we need to get if we're going to explain the reality of the moral law. We do indeed see that it is to our advantage to live in a society where murder and theft are not common. We can hardly be safe or happy otherwise. And so we agree to the rules and mostly follow them ourselves. But this theory fails to answer the most basic question of all. Why should we follow the rules that are beneficial to society as a whole in a situation where we think we would personally benefit from breaking them and think we could get away with it. Why should we follow them in that situation? Why should we follow the rules in that situation? Morality reduced to utilitarianism quickly ceases to be morality at all. It practically becomes a version of might makes right. All these theories, in failing, have something in common. They utterly fail to account for the intuition of oughtness that is an essential part of our moral sense. As Lewis summarized this point in another book, in Problem of Pain, you can juggle concepts like desire, compulsion, advantage, and fear. I want, I must, I would be better off, I don't dare, forever, without getting the slightest hint of I ought to out of them. An ethical system that can give you no reason why you should follow it is not much of an ethical system at all. Now, ought is etymologically related to owe. You can only owe something to a person, and you can only have an absolute obligation to an ultimate person. But we're getting ahead of ourselves at this point. At this point, Lewis has only established that secular explanations of morality cannot explain morality. He's finally ready to ask, what lies behind the law? To answer this question, Lewis notes that there are two basic views of the universe. The impersonal universe of matter and energy is all that there is, and it's just going on by itself, or there is something behind it that is more like a mind than anything else. Well, the foregoing discussion of moral law sheds light on that larger question, because there is one part of the universe that we can see from the inside as well as the outside, and that part is ourselves. And when we look inside ourselves, we find two phenomena that are very hard to describe simply as cogs in an impersonal materialistic machine. One is reason itself, and the second one is our sense of obligation to obey the moral law. Reason itself, cross-reference the argument from reason in miracles, and our obligation to obey the moral law brings us back to the point of the current argument. That sense of obligation suggests that we are not on our own. And with the failures of the secular explanations, it suggests that something like a personal God makes more sense as an answer to the question of why that moral sense is there. You can only have an obligation to a person. If we are inescapably obligated, to whom are we obligated? To each other? Well, it's not big enough, because, I might like some of you and not like others. I might not care what some of you think. And why should you be able to tell me what to do anyway? But God, if He exists, is in that position of authority. Okay. The last step is to see what else can we find out about this something like a mind that seems to lie behind the universe. The universe itself suggests that it is powerful because the vast universe exists, that it is intelligent because the universe is mathematically orderly and fine-tuned for life. But the moral law tells us even more, just as listening to a person talk tells you different things about him than examining something he has made. It tells us that God is fully personal, with moral character as well as intelligence, and that if these moral principles are as absolute as they would have to be in an uncreated, omnipotent, and eternal person, then we are in serious trouble. Theism, then, is true because it is the best explanation for the existence of the law. And finally, Christian theism has the deepest recognition of the problem of personal guilt that the law creates, and the most radical solution to it in the atonement offered by Christ. That's Lewis's version of the moral argument from Mere Christianity. Well, what about some critiques of the argument from Mere Christianity? The supercilious person smirking on the right is David Hume, in case you were wondering. And he's going to show up in this section. Lewis makes a good move in presenting the moral argument not as a deductive proof, but as an argument to the best explanation, or if you like technical terms, an abductive, not inductive or deductive, but abductive argument, an argument to the best explanation. He offers the moral argument not as a slam dunk proof, but modestly as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And it certainly is that. The difficulties in explaining the central concept of morality, its oughtness on a secular basis, and the fact that the law makes more sense if we assume a lawgiver behind it, are suggestive. They suggest that the existence of God is not an ancient myth that persists for illogical reasons, but that it can be seen as a hypothesis that makes sense of some very significant facts that are defining facts of human existence. If we can find them confirmed by other arguments and by religious experience, then belief in God can be seen, not as a delusion, but as a reasonable act of intelligence. It is reasonable to conclude on this basis that theism, the existence of a personal God like the God of the Bible, is true. The second step of the argument, showing the failure of naturalistic theories to account for morality, is where Lewis is often attacked. The charge is that he has committed the fallacies of false dilemma and straw man by leaving out this or that naturalistic theory that is held to succeed where Lewis's allegedly weak examples failed. As Baggett admits, any such argument needs to avoid giving short shrift to any legitimate moral theory in contention. But Lewis could hardly have offered an exhaustive critique of all such theories, especially not in a 10-minute radio broadcast. What he did instead was to give us representative examples of such theories and show the lines along which refutations of them could be successfully attempted. He sketches the first steps in doing so. If the examples are indeed representative, and if we realize that Lewis is only getting us started in dealing with them, then his summary of this step in the argument can be seen as successful, even though people are carping at it saying, well, you didn't deal with this or that. And if you're going to say, well, you committed straw man because you didn't deal with this secular explanation that actually works, then you've got to give us one that actually works. There's the rub that makes calamity of so long arguments. What have Lewis's critics said about his use of the moral argument? John Bever Slice is a representative example. He argues that Lewis's refutation of moral subjectivism is vitiated by the fact that he treats it as a single genus when actually there are more sophisticated and nuanced versions that cannot be disposed of so easily. The example we offered is Hume's theory of morals as based on human feeling, which Bever Slice claims is not susceptible to Lewis's loose canon generalizations. Hume argues, here we go, there's Hume's argument. Hume argues that the notion of morals implies some sentiment common to all mankind, which recommends the same object to general approbation and makes every man or most men agree in the same opinion or decision concerning it. As Bever Slice summarizes it in Hume's theory of ethics, morality is a completely human enterprise based on dispositions that have evolved over a long period of time, have taken deep root in human nature, and are all but universal. If Hume's explanation is plausible, Bever Slice argues, then there's no reason to accept Lewis's contention that accounts of morality that lack a divine moral lawgiver fail to account for the essence and reality of morality. It could have just come about that human beings sort of reached these common agreements on things. through experience. And if that is the case, then Lewis's whole argument for theism becomes moot. Well, I think Hume's theory is very susceptible to Lewis's critique. In fact, I think it can be doubted whether Hume's view is properly a theory of ethics at all, since it has absolutely no answer to Lewis's charge that subjectivist ethics is unable to account for the word ought. That is, it offers an account of where moral feelings or sentiments might have come from, but this account, even if it's true, gives us no reason why we ought to follow them. Why should I care that most other human beings have sentiments that lead them to think of the act I want to do as wrong, if I think I can get away with it and it will benefit me? Why should I care? Thus, Hume is precisely susceptible to Lewis's charge that subjectivist ethics leaves us in the absurd position of having no moral grounds for our opposition to the Holocaust. Hume's theory of sentiment is just a fancier way of leaving us in a position where might makes right. Beverslice thinks Lewis is guilty of a false dilemma because he does not explicitly refute every single version of subjectivist ethics that has ever been proposed. But when the philosophical jargon is stripped away from the allegedly more nuanced views, it is not clear at all that Beverslice has made his charge of false dilemma stick. Rather, I would say he just muddies the water. The other forms of subjectivism remain species of the genus, and they lead to the same place, in my judgment. After everything Beverslice can do, the superiority of God as an explanation for the moral sense of human beings still stands. Other attempts to provide a naturalistic basis for morality fall prey to a similar problem. There are lots of them. They're all over the place. Such theorists think that all they need to do is to produce a plausible natural explanation of how moral sentiments might have arisen. But when they have done so, they fail to notice that even if their scenario is true, it provides no account of why we should follow these sentiments. Lewis's best insight then may have been his focus on oughtness as the central concept in the whole discussion. My analysis of Lewis's argument then is that I think Lewis's final step is actually the weakest one. The bridge Lewis tries to build from theism to Christianity is based on the answer Christianity gives to the problem of guilt raised by the moral argument. Now, Lewis is insightful here. I appreciate what he has to say. I appreciate his analysis. But just because Christianity theoretically offers a radical solution to the problem of moral guilt, it does not follow that it is true or that this solution is there for us. This weakness results from one of Lewis's virtues. Often our virtues and our failings are tied together, kind of ironically, in this complicated fallen world. That is, Lewis is doing the moral argument, and so he's sticking with it. He's not introducing other arguments because he's doing the moral argument right now, and he's going to do it until he finishes. Okay? But, like all the classical arguments, the moral argument can suggest that theism is true, but cannot of itself establish that the God of the Bible is the one who exists or that Jesus is his son. It would have been better if Lewis had explicitly acknowledged here what we realize from other writings and from later in Mere Christianity he knew was the case. That in order to nail down the Christian faith as the one to which the moral argument points, we would need to support it with other arguments. Lewis's trilemma, that's the next thing coming up. But we're just looking at the section on the moral argument. And while you're in it and you're only thinking about the moral argument, you're thinking, okay, Lewis, Jack, that's a nice theory, but how do I know that's actually the case? Lewis's trilemma, the historical argument for the resurrection of Christ, etc., are required to take the theoretical bridge Lewis gives us here and add steel and concrete to it so that traffic can pass over it. Okay, so I've spent 2/3 of my lecture building up to what my topic is supposed to be, which is the abolition of man. So what does the abolition of man contribute to the moral argument? The abolition of man provides crucial auxiliary support for two claims essential to the moral argument: the objectivity of value and the universality of basic moral values to which the argument claims the human race is subject. The bulk of the book deals with the issue of objectivity, and an appendix provides documentary evidence for universality from a plethora of religious and cultural traditions. Lewis starts with a composition book, a composition textbook designed for the upper forms of schools, in American terms, senior high school English. The book was The Control of Language by Alec King and Martin Ketley, but Lewis charitably disguises it as The Green Book, and its author is Gaius and Titius, probably because he wanted to focus on the point rather than the personalities. Gaius and Titius had referred to a famous passage in which the English Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge had objected to a tourist calling a waterfall pretty, saying, no, the correct adjective for this waterfall is not pretty, it's sublime. And of course, in the back of Coleridge's mind is a whole discussion going all the way back to classical theorists about the meaning of these words. Coleridge said you shouldn't call it pretty, you should call it sublime. Now, Gaius and Titius comment that while it appeared that Coleridge was making a remark about the waterfall, in actuality he was not talking about the waterfall at all, but only making a remark about his own feelings. The waterfall is pretty. Coleridge takes that as a factual claim that can be supported or attacked. He wanted to attack it. Gaius and Titius say it's not telling you anything about the waterfall, it's only telling you about how the guy felt about it. It's not a statement about the waterfall at all, it's only a statement about his feelings. Lewis sees this as a huge problem. The schoolboy who reads it will receive two messages: that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker, and that all such statements are unimportant. Well, why is this a problem? In the first place, it's dishonest. The schoolboy thinks he's doing his English prep. He's actually being fed a particular philosophical position presented without argument as a simple truth so obvious it needs no support. Presented without argument. In the second place, it is a philosophy that Lewis thinks must undermine ethics, theology, politics, indeed Western civilization itself, not to mention the very possibility of human beings retaining their full humanity. If you weren't at Phil Fernandez's talk this afternoon, you need to get that recording because he unfolds exactly how prophetic that was. The philosophy hidden in the Green Book was logical positivism, a radical updating of Hume's skeptical empiricism. In a commendable attempt to free philosophy from meaningless speculation, it proposed the verification principle. The meaning of any statement can be given by specifying the set of conditions, assumed to be physical and empirical conditions, that would serve to verify or falsify the statement. If such conditions can be specified, the statement is considered not so much. If no such conditions can be specified, okay, the meaning of any statement is you give the meaning by specifying the conditions that will serve to verify or falsify it. So if I say, it is raining, okay, and we send Josh outside and he comes back in wet, that verifies the statement. If he comes back in dry, that falsifies it. That's what the statement means. All right? But a statement like God is a Trinity, try to specify a set of conditions that would verify or falsify. Now, actually we can do that, but the problem is that only physical conditions are allowed. Only empirical conditions are allowed. Those are the only things recognized as conditions. If no such conditions can be specified, the statement is considered not so much false as meaningless. It looks like a proposition because it has the grammatical form of a proposition, but it actually makes no assertion of fact about the world. It is a pseudo-statement, which does not even need to be refuted, simply rejected from any consideration of its truth value because, in theory, it cannot possibly have any. Well, let's up the stakes. Instead of talking about aesthetic values, is the waterfall pretty or is it sublime? Let's throw another type of statement out. Take, for example, the statement, murder is wrong. What set of empirical observations could possibly verify such a claim? Empirically, we could establish that murder is painful to the victim's relatives, or perhaps even destructive to society. But none of those facts can establish that murder is wrong without appeal to a prior claim like being destructive to society is wrong, which has the same problem as the original claim. So the conclusion of positivism is that only empirical statements are real statements of truth or falsehood about the world. Murder is wrong then, not actually held to be utterly meaningless. They kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth on that. But it doesn't have the meaning it appears to have. The person who says it really means, I do not like murder, or I reject murder, or I condemn murder, or I object to murder. It's not a statement about objective reality, but only about the speaker. That's all the verification principle allows it to be. So all statements of value are not statements about the waterfall at all, but statements about the speaker's feelings. Now, Lewis is going to sneak up on moral values here. It's straight out about moral values in Mere Christianity. He starts out with other values, aesthetic values, because he wants to show you here that the same argument that turns all moral values into subjective statements does the same thing to every kind of value. Value is value. Either values can be real truths about the world or they can't. And when Lewis was writing, we were coming into the period, this is in the 40s, but we're coming into the period, the 50s through the 70s, when logical positivism was the dominant philosophy in all the philosophy departments in the major universities in the West. All statements of value are not statements about the waterfall, but statements about the speaker's feelings. The Green Book's example is an aesthetic value statement rather than a moral one, but all values must be treated the same way if the verification principle is taken to be the final word of what can be said. Now, I think the verification principle is a very useful tool. I don't think it's a universal truth. It's a useful tool, but the problem is this. To all this, the proper response is that there's simply no reason why we have to accept it. Why not? Because the verification principle is, as applied by logical positivists, is vitiated by its unstated assumption of materialism. Only physical conditions are allowed as conditions that satisfy it. Okay? And this is a proposition that the verification principle itself is incapable of verifying. Well, the verification principle is a statement that the verification principle is incapable of verifying. the answer to that is, well, it's a tautology. It's true by definition. Yeah, because you defined it that way. But if we don't start with an assumption of materialism, the verification principle won't yield the results that positivism almost universally claimed that it did. So, there we are. Lewis's first move, therefore, is simply to make us aware of this begged question by making us aware of the alternative. Okay? These guys are talking, and they've gotten away with it in academia. And in fact, in another 10 years, that would be even more true than it was when Lewis wrote. They're getting away with it. They're pulling the wool over our eyes because they're sneaking materialism into this thing that sounds like a very useful methodological way of keeping philosophy from being dumb. And in fact, there was an awful lot of dumb speculation that needed to be weeded out, and the thing did a good job. But when you turn it into an absolute, and when you are dishonest about the fact that, by the way, we're sneaking materialism in between the lines while you're not looking, and that's the way we're applying this. And so you don't realize that all these things that we seem like we've proved, we haven't done anything except beg the question. So Lewis makes us aware of this by stating the alternative and doing it wonderfully. Until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could either be congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or contempt. It is the doctrine of objective value. The belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is. It's like, in the 1940s, when Lewis said that, if you understood him, and apparently people only began gradually to get this, the importance of it, but if you understood this, it's like, oh, wow. Why not? We've been told logical positivism proved why not, but it doesn't. It just begs the question, why not? Why should we accept, well, instead of why not, let's ask why. Why should we accept this alternative, the doctrine of objective value, as true? Lewis observes first that denying it leads to self-contradiction. While they insist on the subjectivity of traditional values, Gaius and Titius have shown by the very act of writing the Green Book that there must be some other values about which they are not subjective at all. They care that people aren't deceived by metaphysical statements and unverifiable statements, and they're trying to keep us from believing what they think is false, and they think that's objectively important. Now, they wouldn't say that, but if they didn't think that, why would they write the book? There are other values about which they are not subjective at all. Clyde Kilby noted, "It's an odd thing that the debunker of values who insists that the waterfall is merely whatever one's emotions make of it will write a textbook teaching that doctrine to children." You obviously feel there's something important about that isn't just your subjective feeling. He adds, to write a textbook debunking the notion of objective values is to contradict the very idea assumed by the act of writing. For such an activity proves that one value was not subjective and trivial, namely the debunker's own. The doctrine of subjective value, in other words, is one that many people defend but nobody practices. just like we said about relativism earlier. People think they're relativists, but you can prove that they're not by knocking them in the head and stealing their wallet. Not an approved apologetic method, but, it would make that point. And the same thing happens here, whether it's relativism or subjectivism. As Lewis puts it, the skepticism about the value of people like Gaius and Titius is only on the surface. It is for use on other people's values. About the values current in their own set, they are not nearly skeptical enough. Once we have escaped the shackles of a gratuitously assumed materialism, we have the chance to realize that we are confronted with the reality of a world that contains a core set of values that are not arbitrary, but are non-material truths about the way the world really is. They are so basic that they cannot be proved, but have to be accepted as axiomatic, so self-evident that they neither demand nor admit proof. You cannot justify the demand to respect human life or human property on the ground that it's good for society, because if you did not already accept it, you would have no way to answer the question, why should we do good to society? You try to avoid these values, but you can't, because they're hidden in the alternative statements that you try to make without them. So we cannot avoid the conclusion that some things are inherently good or evil. That is, their inherent goodness or evil is a real truth. They are not good because they please us, but good for their own sake. If nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. Similarly, Lewis says, if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, nothing is obligatory at all. Lewis calls this core of objective value the Tao, not because he wants to promote Chinese philosophy, but because he wants to make the point that objective value is not just a smokescreen for Western ideals. This leads us from the objectivity of true values to their universality. The universality of the Tao flows from its non-arbitrariness. It is not one among many systems of value, but the sole source of all value judgments. Lewis argues the effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There never has been and there never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems, or as they now call them, ideologies, all consist of fragments from the Tao itself, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole, and then swollen to madness in their isolation, yet still owing to the Tao and to it alone such validity as they possess. If you want to see a fictional incarnation of this idea, this argument, the first volume of the Space Trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, conversation between Oyarsa and Weston. It's hilarious, and it shows this happening in a very, very graphic way. Lewis concludes, the human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary color, or indeed creating a new sun and a new sky for it to move in. The universality of the most basic values then flows from their axiomatic character. One can no more adopt a new set than can set forth, then you can no more adopt a new set of basic values than you can set forth a new multiplication table. Ethical debate, therefore, is limited to questions of application. One can ask what the specific boundaries are between murder and self-defense or other forms of justifiable homicide. One can ask to whom the prohibition of murder applies. Members of other tribes? Let's hope not. Members of other tribes, the unborn? But to question whether human life deserves respect is to leave the conversation altogether. It is to secede from the race of sane human beings, hence the title, The Abolition of Man. People whose thinking has been so corrupted by the new subjectivism that they jettison the real truth of objective value as meaningless statements only of emotion, are in danger of reaching a point of no return. It's not that they are bad men, Lewis says. They are not men at all. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. The rest of the book deals with the potential effects of this subjectivism on education and politics. It is chillingly prophetic of some of the places to which we have come, but that is outside the scope of this paper, because Phil didn't exactly explain to me what he had in mind when he asked me to write it. That's outside the scope of this paper. We return to the contributions of the book to the moral argument. Lewis concludes with an appendix in which he illustrates the universality he has claimed for the foundational values of the Tao. His purpose is not to prove the validity of the Tao by demonstrating its universality inductively, for the Tao, remember, is axiomatic, but simply to manifest that universality to those who might doubt it. Because we've been lied to about how different the moralities of other cultures are. And the data doesn't support that thesis. Simply, he wants to manifest it to those who might doubt it. It does not set out to demonstrate absolute agreement on every ethical question. That's not the point. But rather to show that there is an impressive level of agreement on basic values across religions and cultures, which our relativistic-leaning academia would not have led us to suspect. As Michael Ward puts it, Lewis's thesis is not that all moralities coincide on every point, but that they all derive from a single source, the universally accessible Tao, natural law. Seen from this perspective, Lewis's groupings of maxims from Christian, Muslim, Egyptian, Hindu, ancient Germanic, Greco-Roman, and pagan sources on topics such as general and special beneficence, duties to parents, elders, children, and posterity, justice, honesty, mercy, etc., are an impressive testimony to the non-arbitrariness, unity, ubiquity, and universality of the Tao. Are Lewis's points in The Abolition of Man still relevant 80 years later? Well, logical positivism no longer dominates philosophy departments. And its replacement, postmodernism, in its various manifestations, might seem to be in a very different world from a philosophy that flowed from a desire to put a solid objective foundation under science. Unfortunately, only under science. But we should not miss the fact that positivism and postmodernism, though they seem to be as opposite as any two philosophical positions could be, they are in absolute, total agreement about the subjectivity of value. Positivism held that empirical statements could be truth claims about the world, and everything else was mere subjectivity. Postmodernism has simply revoked empiricism's claim to exemption from the swelling flood of subjectivity that has been the story of modernity. Lewis's defense of objective value, then, is still very much, every bit as much pertinent as it ever was. Okay. Lewis shows us in Mere Christianity that the moral argument gives us a good reason for thinking that God exists. The moral lawgiver is the only explanation for the existence of the moral law that can account for its central feature, its oughtness. He also shows us some useful things about how to use that argument. His use of concrete examples, his focus on the key role of the concept of oughtness, and his example, getting us started in dealing with alternative theories, are all features that we need to incorporate in our own apologetic. Two major issues deserve further thought as we think of applying that example in our own times. First, the relativism and the subjectivism that Lewis was already dealing with have developed more virulent strains than even he could have anticipated 80 years ago. One glaring statement in Mere Christianity stands out as a sign of how much things have changed. The other man seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Well, that's not an unlikely response at all anymore. I mean, the difference between where we are and where Lewis was really comes into focus when you read that paragraph. He could assume things about his audience that we cannot assume about ours. So we have to make some adjustments. Respect for traditional morality in general is at a low ebb, and the seemingly sudden shift in the definition of marriage calls into question the very universality of the moral law as Lewis defended it. Movements such as identity politics and multiculturalism encourage people to focus on differences rather than on what we have in common. People wonder if there is even any common humanity left in our national consciousness that can be appealed to. So we cannot then make an assumption about our audience that Lewis could still afford to make about his. But does this shift overturn his point? No, for two reasons. First, if we look at the whole history of the human race, rather than simply accepting that the last decade or so in the West is as normal as it has come to seem, how quickly we get acclimatized. If we look at the whole history of the human race and the whole human race, rather than simply accepting that the last decade or so in the West is as normal as it has come to seem, we realize how abnormal our own little slice of time in the West is. Until very recently, the traditional definition of marriage as a covenant between one man and one woman was widely accepted, even if not always practiced. There have always been aberrations from the norm, and we are living in one. To attend to the larger sampling of data is to realize that our own moment, far from being normal, is the exception that proves the rule. Here, the abolition of man can help by giving us extra ammunition on this very needed point in two ways. First, it gives an explanation of the axiomatic character of the Tao that is absent from mere Christianity. And second, the appendix provides that larger sampling of data that reveals our own age's aberrations. From each of these boosts to the argument, each of these boosts to the argument are more critically needed now than they were in the year that both of those books were written. Second, Lewis himself in Mere Christianity had already showed us how to deal with those who say, "To hell with your standard." People who say that always say it very selectively. The moment they or someone they care about is a victim of the breach of the moral law, their relativism shows itself to be the cop-out, which is all it is capable of being. Whenever you find a man who says that he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. In the same way, adherents of identity politics can only make a cause for the unjust way they think their favored group has been victimized by appealing to what Lewis called the Tao, the universal standard of right behavior that all eventually must recognize. Lewis already realized that for some people in the modern world, an extra step in the argument would be needed, and he showed us how to take it. Lewis had already shown us the way. The second issue that requires some thought is the step in the moral argument that demands the most work, and that is eliminating alternative explanation, competing explanations for where the law came from. The problem with these things is they're like the TIE fighters in Star Wars. There's too many of them. Fortunately, there aren't enough of them to keep us from blowing up the Death Star. We must be prepared to encounter any number of such theories, and we must remember that Lewis's handling of three representative examples in Mere Christianity was only getting us started in dealing with them. But he got us off on the right foot. We must not assume that we can refute all such theories merely by repeating Lewis's examples, but we should also follow him by focusing on the issue of altness. Plausible theories about how all but universal moral sentiments could have arisen are not necessarily good explanations of how the oughtness of the law can attach to them. And failing to account for that, they have failed to account for the very essence of morality. Finally, we should follow Lewis's example in one more way, one we cannot see while we are inside the material on the moral argument itself. That is, one we will not realize he followed until we have read more of him than the section in Mere Christianity where he gives the moral argument. That argument will serve us best if we see it in the context of the other major arguments, such as the trilemma, the argument from reason, and the argument from desire. Some of them will confirm its suggestion that a God very like the God of the Bible must exist, and others will make the bridge from theism to Christianity stronger and more able to bear the traffic we hope we can direct across it. And that is what apologetics is all about. Now, this perfectly objective academic presentation has strangely been taken over by a totally shameless attempt at self-promotion. If you're interested in Lewis, we have on the left, Mere Humanity, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien on the human condition. It's about the fact that those three Christian thinkers had a robust biblical view of anthropology, of human nature, which they expound in their expository writings and incarnate in their fiction. So Lewis explains in The Abolition of Man and other places what it is to be human, and then he shows us in the Space Trilogy, you have Hrassa, you have Fifiltrigi, you have Sereny, you have Tor and Tenedral and Paralandra. You have creatures that are physical creatures, rational and spiritual creatures, but not human. And they become foils. Both the similarities and the differences between them and the human characters bring into sharp focus what it is to be human. And then Lewis does the same thing in Narnia. You've got talking beasts and sons of Adam and daughters of Eve that do the same thing. In Tolkien, you've got elves, dwarves, etc., which perform the same function. So this is an exposition of these guys' expository development of the doctrine of man, then showing how it's fleshed out in their fiction to make those connections. The central book, Deeper Magic, The Theology Behind the Writings of C.S. Lewis, the only treatment of Lewis's theology that is comprehensive and critical. There are others that are basically summaries of it, which I think is pretty pointless. I mean, why take Lewis's brilliant prose and translate it into my mediocre prose and publish it as a book? Read Lewis instead. Or they only focus on one doctrine or one set of doctrines. This goes through all of Lewis's writings, published and some unpublished, and goes through the table of contents of a systematic theology text and asks on each one of those topics, what is Lewis's presentation of truth in this area, and what are its strengths and weaknesses as a guide to biblical truth? It has a lot of strengths, it has a few weaknesses, and I try to be honest about both. The other book that's related to Lewis would be the one on Tolkien, An Encouraging Thought, the Christian Worldview in the Writings of Tolkien. But then on the far right, you have The Young Christian's Survival Guide, common questions young Christians are asked about God, the Bible, and the Christian faith. Answered, 19 questions. The title came from the publisher. It's called Young Christian's Survival Guide, but old Christians are permitted to read it too. In fact, old Christians could really profitably read it and then use it as a curriculum for their youth group or their high school senior apologetics class or college level. What I do is I deal with 19 different questions, and I deal with the traditional questions, but I learned something from teaching apologetics. I might have learned more than my students did. We would have debates, okay? And so one student would take the Christian position, the other student would be assigned to defend the non-Christian position. So we'd have a debate on the inerrancy of Scripture. And the Christian would think, or the guy playing the Christian, hopefully they were both Christians, he would come in, he would think he knew what he needed to do, and so he would come in and trot out a whole bunch of stuff about the authenticity and historicity and accuracy. And, you know, and then the non-Christian would get up and say, who cares? The Bible is an immoral book. If it's inspired, that just makes it worse because it supports genocide and racism and the oppression of women and homophobia and xenophobia and every kind of evil. And it's an evil book, and anybody who follows it is an evil person. And the Christian would get that deer in the headlights look because, see, the non-Christian knew that he didn't already know what he was supposed to say. So he went to actual atheist websites and found out what they're saying. And I realized even my kids who were apologetics nerds, they were well prepared to deal with the old questions, but there's a whole new set that caught them flat-footed. And so I deal with the traditional questions because we still have to deal with that. It's still important. But half the book is what about the Bible and genocide? What about the Bible and all of these other things? So it's more focused on the new kind of questions that you're actually going to get on a secular campus or in the marketplace today, and which the apologetics industrial complex is doing a pivot to begin to address, but we're behind on that. I'm trying to get out ahead of the curve in that book. And then, of course, you know, Phil says this is a good book, and I think he's a pretty good critic. I agree with him. 95 Theses for a New Reformation. We're all praying for revival, and rightly so. I've become convinced that something even more basic is required. We're not going to get the kind of revival that we actually need unless we have reformation first. You can only revive something that you've got. And we're losing, as an evangelical movement, we're losing our grip on the doctrines of the Reformation. So it's a new Reformation, not as in different, but as in renewed. And starts with the 5 Theses and then goes on to ask, if Luther was looking at us today and responding not to the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, but the corruption of the evangelical Big Eva, what might those 95 Theses look like? This is my take on that. So all these books are on the book table, and you can pay Amazon $25 for this, plus shipping, or you can give me $15 and walk away with it. It's a simple question, how good a steward of your time and resources you want to be. We probably don't have time for questions because we got a very late start. And I think I took roughly my hour once I got given it. But we're probably all getting worn out. So if anybody has any questions or comments or rabbit holes that you'd like to pursue, I'll be hanging around and we can do that.